You think you know what love looks like, don't you? White dresses, flower petals, promises whispered under moonlight. How beautifully naive. Tonight, while you scroll through wedding photos on your phone, sipping your overpriced coffee, I'm going to tear away the romantic veil you've wrapped around one of history's most brutal institutions. You see, I've walked through the smoke-filled halls of Viking longhouses. I've heard the screams that echoed through Scandinavian nights between 793 and 1066 AD, and I can tell you this, what you call marriage, they called warfare by other means. Close your eyes for a moment. Can you smell it? That acrid mixture of unwashed bodies, fermented fish, and something else. Something metallic that clings to the back of your throat like a warning. That's the scent of a Viking wedding feast. And if you think the ceremony was the romantic part, you're about to discover just how wrong you are. Because in the frozen wastelands of medieval Scandinavia, marriage wasn't about love, it wasn't about choice, and it certainly wasn't about the bride's happiness. Let me paint you a picture that will haunt your next anniversary dinner. Picture Astrid, a 13-year-old girl whose voice still cracks when she's nervous, standing in a dimly lit longhouse while men twice her father's age examine her like livestock at market. Her hands shake not from cold, but from the terrible knowledge of what's coming. The negotiations have been going on for months, but she was never part of them. She was the prize, the commodity, the breathing currency that would seal alliances and merge territories. You want to know the most disturbing part? This wasn't considered cruel. This was Tuesday. This was normal. This was how civilizations were built, one terrified girl at a time. The archaeological evidence from sites like Birka and Sweden tells us stories that would make your skin crawl. Excavated graves reveal the brutal reality, women buried with their jewelry, their household tools, and the unmistakable marks of violence on their bones. But here's what the history books don't tell you, what the sanitized documentaries conveniently skip over. Many of these women were buried alive with their deceased husbands, drugged with ergot-laced ale and lowered conscious into the earth as the ultimate wedding gift to the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab chronicler who witnessed these rituals in 922 AD, described scenes that Hollywood wouldn't dare recreate. He wrote about slave girls, selected for their beauty, who were ritually intoxicated, sexually assaulted by the dead chieftain's men, and then strangled with a rope while being stabbed repeatedly. This wasn't a funeral. This was a wedding reception that extended into death itself. But let's talk about the living brides, shall we? The ones who survived their wedding nights and had to navigate the labyrinth of Viking marital expectations. Marriage in Viking society was called gift, literally meaning given. Notice how perfectly that word captures the transaction, how it strips away any pretense of choice or consent. The bride was given, like cattle, like land, like any other piece of property that changed hands between powerful men. The groom's family would pay a bride price to the father, not as compensation for losing a daughter, but as payment for acquiring breeding stock in a political alliance. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterclass in psychological domination dressed up as tradition. The couple would exchange swords, his representing his strength and authority, hers representing her submission to his protection. But here's the part that will make your blood run cold. If the bride was deemed unsuitable after the ceremony, if she failed to please her new master, the marriage could be dissolved, and she could be cast out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back. And winter in Scandinavia, my friend, does not forgive. The wedding feast that followed was less celebration than declaration of ownership. The bride would serve ale to every male guest, starting with her new husband's family, a ritual that reinforced her position as servant to his bloodline. The ale itself was often spiked with ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that grew on rye, ensuring that the bride remained compliant and disoriented during the festivities that would determine the rest of her life. Archaeological evidence from Oseberg and Gokstad burial mounds reveals the tools of Viking matrimony, iron keys worn by married women, not as symbols of domestic authority, but as literal chains of responsibility. These keys unlocked storage chests, food stores, and household supplies, but they also locked the women into a role from which there was no escape. The key was both symbol and shackle, freedom and prison, all wrapped into one cold piece of metal that hung around a woman's neck until death. But here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. The Vikings had a practice called wife-taking during raids. When they conquered a settlement, the most beautiful women were selected not for slavery, but for forced marriage to the victorious warriors. These women, torn from their families, their cultures, their very identities, were expected to embrace their captors, bear their children, and pretend gratitude for the privilege. Imagine watching your village burn, your family slaughtered, and then being dressed in wedding clothes the next day. Imagine being forced to smile, to participate in rituals that celebrated your own destruction, to consummate a union with the man who murdered your father. This was the reality for thousands of women across medieval Europe, women whose names we'll never know, whose screams have been lost to the wind and time. The legal codes of medieval Scandinavia, preserved in documents like the Gulliting Law and the Frost-Athing Law, reveal the true nature of Viking marriage with clinical precision. A woman could be divorced for being barren, for talking back, for failing to manage the household to her husband's satisfaction, or simply for displeasing him in ways too numerous to catalog. But divorce wasn't liberation. It was a death sentence. A divorced woman had no legal standing, no right to property, no protection under law. She became a non-person, invisible to society, vulnerable to any man who wanted to claim her. The most chilling aspect of Viking marriage wasn't the violence, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't the sexual slavery, though that was certainly present. No, the most terrifying element was how thoroughly the system convinced women that their suffering was noble, that their sacrifice was sacred, that their pain was the price of civilization itself. And you know what the most disturbing part is? As you sit there, comfortable in your modern world, convinced that we've evolved beyond such barbarism, consider this. The fundamental structure hasn't changed as much as you'd like to believe. Marriage is still, in many ways, about property, about control, about the transfer of women between men. We've just gotten better at hiding the chains, at making the cage look like a choice. The next time you see a bride walking down the aisle, remember Astrid. Remember those keys. Remember the screams that echoed through Viking longhouses 1,000 years ago. Because that history isn't as distant as you think, and those shadows are longer than you dare imagine. But this story, it's just beginning. The wedding was only the first horror. What came after, what happened behind closed doors in those frozen halls, makes the ceremony look like mercy. And I'm going to tell you all of it, every sickening detail, every buried truth that historians have spent centuries trying to forget. You thought the wedding was the end of the horror story, didn't you? How charmingly optimistic. But here's the thing about Viking marriages that will make your skin crawl. The ceremony was just the appetizer. The real feast of suffering began when the guests went home, when the torches burned low, and when the new bride found herself alone with her owner in the suffocating darkness of a medieval longhouse. Let me take you inside that first night, into the private chambers where screams were muffled by thick wooden walls, and where a 13-year-old girl learned that her childhood had just died a violent death. The archaeological evidence from Hedeby and Jorvik tells us these chambers were small, windowless spaces barely large enough for a sleeping bench and a wooden chest. But size wasn't the issue, was it? The problem was what happened in that confined space, what the law not only permitted but encouraged. Viking law was crystal clear about marital rape, though they didn't call it that. They called it husbandly rights. The Icelandic sagas, those supposedly heroic tales we romanticize today, are littered with casual references to men taking their wives regardless of consent, resistance, or physical condition. In the Laxdæla saga, Kjartan forces himself on Hrefna on their wedding night while she weeps and begs him to wait. The saga presents this as normal, expected, even admirable masculine behavior. But here's where it gets truly sick. The morning after the wedding night, the bloodied bedsheets would be displayed publicly as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. Imagine being a teenage girl, violated and traumatized, then having your pain paraded before the entire community as entertainment. The stained fabric became a trophy, a banner celebrating masculine conquest and feminine destruction. The Vikings had a word for this ritual humiliation: proof of honor. Honor. Let that word burn in your throat for a moment. They called the public display of a child's sexual trauma honor. Now let's talk about what happened after that first night, shall we? Because the real horror wasn't the initial violation, it was the systematic destruction of human dignity that followed, day after day, year after year, until the woman forgot she had ever been anything more than property. Viking wives were expected to be perpetually available for their husbands' sexual demands. The legal codes make this abundantly clear. A woman who refused her husband could be beaten, divorced, or, in extreme cases, killed without legal consequence. The Glathing law specifically states that a man may correct his wife with reasonable force if she fails to fulfill her marital duties. And reasonable force was defined by the husband, not by any external authority. Archaeological evidence from women's graves across Scandinavia reveals a pattern so disturbing that modern researchers struggle to discuss it openly. Female skeletons from the Viking period show unusually high rates of pelvic fractures, rib damage, and skull trauma consistent with repeated domestic violence. But here's the part that will haunt your dreams. Many of these injuries show signs of healing, meaning these women survived attack after attack, year after year, their bodies becoming living maps of masculine brutality. The most chilling discovery came from a mass grave near Trelleborg, Denmark, where archaeologists found the remains of 12 women, all between the ages of 15 and 25, all showing signs of violent death. Carbon dating placed them in the late 10th century, right in the heart of the Viking expansion period. But here's what makes your blood run cold. They were all buried in wedding jewelry. These weren't random victims of warfare. These were brides who had been murdered by their own husbands, their deaths so common that they merited a communal burial site. Let me introduce you to Gudrun, whose story was preserved in the Volsunga saga, though sanitized for medieval audiences. Gudrun was married to Sigurd, a legendary hero whose reputation for violence extended far beyond the battlefield. When Sigurd discovered that Gudrun had spoken to another man without permission, he tied her to their marriage bed and systematically broke every finger on her left hand, one joint at a time, while explaining that her body belonged to him and him alone. The saga presents this as a reasonable response to feminine disobedience. It was included not as a cautionary tale, but as an instructional one, teaching young men how to properly discipline their wives and young women how to avoid provoking their husband's righteous anger. But the physical violence was only one layer of the nightmare. Viking wives were also subject to psychological torture that would make modern interrogators blush. They were forbidden from speaking to men outside their household, forbidden from leaving the longhouse without permission, forbidden from making any decisions about their own lives or their children's futures. They lived in a state of constant surveillance, where any behavior could be interpreted as defiance and punished accordingly. The most insidious aspect of this system was how it weaponized motherhood against women. Viking wives were expected to produce sons, preferably many sons, to serve as warriors and continue the family line. But here's the twist that will make you sick. If a wife gave birth to daughters, if she miscarried, or if she was deemed barren, she could be replaced. Not divorced, replaced. The husband would simply take a second wife, relegating the first to the status of unpaid servant in her own household. Archaeological evidence from Burka reveals the remains of households with multiple adult women, their graves showing clear hierarchies of treatment. The primary wives were buried with jewelry and weapons, symbols of their status as mothers of sons. The secondary wives were buried with household tools and work implements, markers of their degraded position as domestic labor. But most disturbing of all were the failed wives, buried without any grave goods at all, their bodies dumped in unmarked plots like refuse. The Vikings had a practice called wife-lending that reveals the true depths of their matrimonial depravity. When important guests visited, the host would offer his wife's sexual services as a form of hospitality. The wife had no say in this arrangement. She was simply informed that she would be entertaining the guest that evening. Refusal wasn't an option. The practice was so common that it had its own legal framework, complete with rules about pregnancy, disease transmission, and compensation. Ibn Rusta, a 10th century Persian explorer, documented this practice with clinical detachment. When a man of importance visits, the host offers him bread, meat, and his wife's body. The wife must comply without complaint, for to refuse would bring shame upon the household and justify severe punishment. But here's where the story becomes truly nightmarish. Some Viking wives began to internalize their oppression so completely that they became enforcers of the system that destroyed them. Archaeological evidence from Oseberg shows grave goods that include whips, restraints, and punishment devices buried alongside typical household items, suggesting that some wives were responsible for disciplining other women in the household. The slave wives, the concubines, the daughters-in-law, all fell under the authority of the primary wife, who had been so thoroughly broken by the system that she perpetuated its violence to maintain her precarious position. The oppressed became the oppressor, the victim became the victimizer, and the cycle of abuse continued unbroken through generations. The most haunting discovery came from a grave near Uppsala, Sweden, where archaeologists found the skeleton of a woman buried in a position that suggested she had been bound hand and foot at the time of death. But she wasn't alone. Beside her lay the remains of 3 children, all under the age of 10, all showing signs of strangulation. The grave goods suggested this was a family burial, but the evidence pointed to something far more sinister, a murder-suicide. A wife and mother who had chosen death over continued enslavement, taking her children with her to spare them the same fate. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar graves have been found across Scandinavia, silent testimonies to the desperation of women who saw no escape from their matrimonial prisons, except through death itself. These women became martyrs to a system that viewed their suffering as entertainment and their deaths as property damage. And you know what the most disturbing part is? As you read these words, comfortable in your belief that such horrors are ancient history, women around the world are living variations of these same nightmares. The tools have changed, the locations have shifted, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Marriage as ownership, wives as property, and violence as the ultimate expression of masculine authority. But we're not done yet. What I've shown you so far is just the surface, the obvious brutality that even medieval chroniclers couldn't completely hide. Wait until you discover what happened to the wives who tried to fight back, who dared to resist, who thought they could escape the system that owned them. Their stories will show you that sometimes the cure was worse than the disease, and that the Vikings had methods of punishment that make everything I've described so far look like mercy. You're probably wondering about the women who fought back, aren't you? The ones who refused to accept their fate, who tried to claw their way out of the matrimonial grave that society had dug for them. Well, let me tell you about resistance in Viking marriage, and why every woman who tried it wished she hadn't. Because the Vikings didn't just punish rebellion, they turned it into an art form, a public spectacle that served as entertainment and education simultaneously. Meet Bergthora, whose story was buried in the Njals saga until modern scholars reluctantly acknowledged its historical basis. Bergthora was married to Gunnar, a warrior whose reputation for violence preceded him into every room, but Bergthora had been raised by a father who, unusually for the time, had taught her to read, to think, to question. This education became her death sentence. When Gunnar attempted to force himself on her during their 3rd night of marriage, Bergthora did something that no Viking wife was supposed to do. She fought back. She clawed at his face, drew blood, and screamed loudly enough to wake the entire household. The saga tells us that Gunnar was so shocked by her resistance that he actually stopped, stepping back in confusion. For a moment, just a moment, Bergthora thought she had won. She was wrong. The next morning, Gunnar convened a household tribunal, a gathering of male relatives and neighbors who would judge Bergthora's crime. Yes, crime. Because in Viking law, a wife's resistance to her husband's sexual demands wasn't just disobedience, it was theft. She was stealing his property rights over her own body, and the punishment was swift and public. They stripped her naked in the longhouse courtyard while the entire community watched. Then they bound her to a wooden post and invited every man present to witness her humiliation. But this wasn't just psychological torture, it was a legal proceeding. Each man was asked to examine her body and testify to her fitness as a wife, commenting on her physical attributes like judges at a livestock auction. The archaeological record from Lofoten confirms that these wife trials were common enough to have their own standardized equipment. Excavations have revealed wooden posts, worn smooth by rope, iron restraints sized specifically for women's wrists and ankles, and what archaeologists delicately call examination tables, where wives were displayed for community judgment. But Bergthora's punishment was just beginning. After the public humiliation, she was sentenced to correction training, a process so savage that modern historians struggle to describe it without triggering trauma responses in their readers. She was confined to a pit beneath the longhouse, a space barely large enough for her to lie down, where she would remain until she learned proper wifely submission. The pit wasn't empty. It contained what the Vikings called lesson givers, iron spikes positioned to pierce any part of her body that moved in the wrong direction, rotting fish that filled the space with nauseating stench, and rats that had been deliberately introduced to nibble at her extremities. She was fed once a day, just enough to keep her alive, and was required to recite pledges of obedience before receiving even that meager sustenance. The most horrifying part? This was considered merciful. The alternative punishment for wifely resistance was something called blood eagle, a ritual execution where the victim's ribs were cut away from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings while the person was still alive. Archaeological evidence from mass graves near Trondheim suggests this wasn't just mythological brutality, it was standard legal procedure. Bergthora lasted 17 days in the pit before she broke completely. When they finally dragged her out, she was no longer the woman who had dared to resist. She had become something else entirely, a hollow shell programmed only for obedience and fear. The saga records that she never spoke again unless directly commanded, never made eye contact with any man, and would begin trembling uncontrollably whenever her husband entered the room. But here's the truly sick part. The community celebrated her transformation. They held a feast to honor Gunnar's successful wife correction, praising his patience and wisdom in rehabilitating his property rather than simply discarding it. Bergthora was paraded before the guests as proof that even the most rebellious woman could be properly trained with sufficient motivation. The Vikings had an entire vocabulary for female resistance and its correction. Bride breaking was the initial process of destroying a new wife's will. Lesson teaching was the ongoing discipline required to maintain proper behavior. Spirit cutting was the final stage, where the woman's personality was completely erased and replaced with programmed responses. Archaeological evidence from graves across Scandinavia reveals the physical toll of these correction methods. Female skeletons show patterns of healed fractures consistent with systematic bone breaking, dental damage from forced feeding of caustic substances, and what forensic anthropologists grimly call compliance scarring, deliberate cuts and burns designed to create permanent reminders of punishment. The most disturbing discovery came from a bog near Aalborg, Denmark, where archaeologists found the perfectly preserved remains of a woman who had been subjected to progressive correction. Her body showed evidence of methodical torture, fingers broken and reset multiple times, toes removed individually, and a pattern of cuts across her torso that spelled out words in Old Norse. The words, property of Olaf. But some women found ways to resist that the system couldn't anticipate or punish. They developed what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative disorders, mentally checking out during their ordeals, while their bodies endured whatever was demanded of them. The sagas sometimes reference wives who seemed to go elsewhere during punishment, whose eyes would become vacant and who would respond to commands without seeming to hear them. The Vikings called this spirit walking, and they considered it a form of witchcraft. Women who displayed these symptoms were often accused of consorting with evil spirits, of leaving their bodies to plot revenge in the supernatural realm. The punishment for spirit walking was immediate execution by drowning, because a wife who could mentally escape was a wife who could potentially inspire others to resistance. The most heartbreaking cases were the women who tried to protect their daughters from the same fate. Archaeological evidence suggests that some mothers would deliberately injure their female children, making them unsuitable for marriage, by creating physical deformities that would repel potential husbands. These women sacrificed their daughters' physical wholeness to preserve their psychological integrity, choosing disability over the matrimonial meat grinder. DNA analysis of remains from family burial sites reveals another form of resistance that makes your blood run cold: maternal infanticide. When faced with the prospect of raising daughters who would inevitably face the same horrors they had endured, some Viking mothers chose to smother their newborn girls rather than subject them to a lifetime of sexual slavery disguised as marriage. The Vikings developed countermeasures for even this desperate form of resistance. They instituted birth watches, where pregnant wives were monitored constantly by other women in the household who would report any suspicious behavior. Mothers caught attempting to harm their daughters faced something called teaching death, execution methods so prolonged and public that it served as education for other women contemplating similar acts of mercy. But perhaps the most insidious form of resistance was the development of what historians now call compliant rebellion. Some wives learned to appear completely submissive, while subtly undermining their husband's authority through methods so sophisticated that they went undetected for years. They would slightly oversalt food, accidentally misplace important items, or provide just enough household mismanagement to create constant low-level frustration without triggering punishment. The saga of Hallgerd the Clever tells the story of a wife who perfected this art form. For 15 years, she appeared to be the model of wifely obedience while systematically destroying her husband's reputation through carefully orchestrated mistakes and misunderstandings. When he finally discovered her methods, the punishment was so severe that chroniclers refused to record the details, noting only that her correction required 3 seasons and left marks that could be seen from across the fjord. Whereas, archaeological evidence from Hallgerd's presumed burial site reveals bones that had been systematically broken and allowed to heal incorrectly, creating a skeleton so deformed that the woman could barely walk upright. But the most chilling discovery was a piece of carved bone found in her grave, inscribed with tiny runes that translated to, "I never surrendered." The Vikings eventually developed psychological torture methods that made physical punishment seem merciful by comparison. They would force resistant wives to watch the rape and murder of their female slaves, explaining that this was their own future if they continued to disobey. They would bring the woman's female relatives into the longhouse and subject them to instructional punishment, while the wife was forced to watch and remain silent. But the most devastating psychological weapon was the threat against their children. A resistant wife would be told that her disobedience put her sons at risk of being sold into slavery and her daughters at risk of being given to the most brutal warriors in the community. The choice was always the same: submit completely or watch your children suffer for your defiance. The breaking point usually came when the woman realized that resistance wasn't heroic, it was selfish. Her rebellion endangered everyone she loved, and the system was designed to ensure that her defiance would always cause more suffering than her submission. The moment that realization hit, the fight went out of her eyes forever. And you know what the most disturbing part is? This systematic destruction of human will was so refined, so psychologically sophisticated, that modern totalitarian regimes have borrowed its techniques. The methods used to break Viking wives became the foundation for political torture, religious persecution, and institutional abuse that continues to this day. But we haven't reached the bottom of this abyss yet, because there's one more layer to this nightmare that makes everything I've told you seem like preparation. Wait until you learn about the children born into these marriages, the sons and daughters who grew up watching their mothers destroyed and who learned that this was what love looked like. Their stories will show you how trauma becomes hereditary, how violence becomes tradition, and how the victims of one generation become the victimizers of the next. You think childhood trauma is a modern concept, don't you? That we've only recently discovered how violence echoes through generations like a curse that refuses to break. How naive. The Vikings understood the inheritance of horror better than any civilization before or since, and they weaponized it with surgical precision. They knew that the most efficient way to create monsters wasn't to train adults, it was to show children that monstrosity was normal, that cruelty was love, and that the screams of their mothers were the lullabies of civilization. Let me take you into the mind of Eriksson, a 7-year-old boy whose earliest memory was watching his father drag his mother across the longhouse floor by her hair while she begged for mercy. But here's the part that will haunt your dreams. Little Eriksson wasn't horrified by this scene. He was bored. Because by age 7, he had witnessed his mother's brutalization so many times that domestic violence had become background noise, as ordinary and unremarkable as the crackling of fire or the howling of wind. The archaeological evidence from children's graves across Scandinavia tells a story that modern researchers struggle to accept. Juvenile skeletons from the Viking period show signs of what forensic anthropologists call environmental violence exposure, stress markers in bone development that indicate chronic psychological trauma from witnessing repeated brutality. These children's bodies were literally shaped by the horror they observed, their very bones warped by the constant flood of terror hormones triggered by their mother's suffering. But here's where it gets truly sick. The Vikings didn't see this as child abuse, they saw it as education. Sons were deliberately exposed to their mother's punishment as part of their masculine training, taught that controlling women through violence was not just acceptable, but essential to their future success as husbands and leaders. Daughters were forced to watch their mother's degradation as preparation for their own eventual submission, learning that female suffering was as natural and inevitable as winter. The most disturbing discovery came from a burial site near Bergen, Norway, where archaeologists found the grave of a family that had died together during a harsh winter. The father, mother, and 3 children were perfectly preserved by the cold, their final moments frozen in time. But the positioning of the bodies revealed a horror that made the excavation team physically ill. The 2 sons, ages 9 and 12, were found with their hands around their mother's throat, while their 7-year-old sister lay curled against the wall with her fingers in her ears. Carbon dating and forensic analysis revealed the truth. The family had been trapped by a blizzard with dwindling food supplies. The mother had apparently tried to save more food for the children by eating less herself, but the father had interpreted this as disobedience, as theft of his authority over resource distribution. He had ordered his sons to strangle their mother as punishment for her selfishness, while forcing their daughter to watch as a lesson in the consequences of feminine weakness. The boys had obeyed without hesitation. The daughter had tried to block out the sounds, and all 3 children had starved to death beside their mother's corpse, too young to understand that the system that demanded her death would ultimately kill them too. This wasn't an isolated incident. Viking sagas are filled with casual references to children participating in the punishment of their mothers, sons as young as 6, being praised for showing proper masculine authority by hitting or restraining their mothers during disciplinary sessions. The Volsunga saga describes young Sigmund as growing into proper manhood, when he began helping his father beat his stepmother for speaking out of turn, but the psychological conditioning went far deeper than simple observation. Viking boys underwent ritual initiations, where they were required to demonstrate their readiness for marriage by participating in the correction of rebellious women. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites across Iceland reveals the remains of ceremonial chambers where adolescent boys would practice wife management on captive women, learning to view female pain as entertainment and female submission as their birthright. The most chilling account comes from Ahmad ibn Rusta's documentation of a coming-of-age ceremony he witnessed near Kiev in 921 AD. He described watching 12-year-old Viking boys take turns sexually assaulting a captured Slavic woman, while their fathers cheered and offered technical advice. The boys who showed hesitation or mercy were beaten by their own fathers until they learned to perform cruelty with enthusiasm. The young wolves must learn to taste blood, one Viking father told Ibn Rusta, or they will never become proper hunters of women. But the conditioning of daughters was even more insidious because it required them to internalize their own destruction. Viking girls were trained from infancy to view their future suffering as noble sacrifice, their pain as proof of their value to society. They were taught songs that celebrated martyred wives, told stories that glorified female submission, and given dolls that came with tiny restraints and punishment accessories. Archaeological excavations of children's graves have revealed toys that make modern investigators physically ill: miniature whips, doll-sized shackles, and wooden figurines positioned in scenes of domestic violence. These weren't aberrations or curiosities. They were standard playthings designed to normalize brutality in the minds of future victims. The most heartbreaking discovery came from a child's grave near Trondheim, where archaeologists found the skeleton of an 8-year-old girl buried with a collection of carved wooden figures. At first glance, they appeared to be a normal family set: mother, father, children. But closer examination revealed that the mother figure had been repeatedly carved with tiny cuts. The father figure held a miniature weapon, and the children figures were positioned as observers to the violence. Analysis of the wear patterns on these toys suggested they had been played with extensively, the violence scenarios reenacted over and over again until they became as familiar and comfortable as any other childhood game. This little girl had spent her short life rehearsing for her own future destruction, learning to find comfort in the very scenarios that would eventually kill her. The psychological sophistication of this conditioning process was staggering. Viking children weren't just taught that violence was normal, they were taught to crave it, to feel incomplete without it, to interpret love through the lens of domination and submission. Sons learned that they could only prove their masculinity by destroying women, while daughters learned that they could only prove their femininity by being destroyed. The sagas preserve fragments of children's rhymes that reveal the depth of this indoctrination. Mother cries, father strikes, this is how our love takes flight. Sister learns and brother grows. Everyone knows how the story goes. Pain is love and love is pain. Sunshine follows after rain. These weren't considered disturbing or inappropriate verses for children to sing. They were considered educational, preparing young minds for the realities of adult relationships in Viking society. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this system was how it created what modern psychologists would recognize as trauma, bonding on a civilizational scale. Children who witnessed their mother's abuse didn't learn to hate their fathers. They learned to worship them as the ultimate arbiters of order and meaning. The same man who destroyed their sense of safety also provided their only protection from an even more dangerous world outside the longhouse. This created a psychological dependency so profound that even grown children would defend the system that had traumatized them, arguing that their father's violence had been necessary, educational, even loving. They became enforcers of their own oppression, victims so thoroughly broken that they volunteered to break others. The most chilling example comes from the story of Gudmund the Wise, preserved in the Heimskringla. Gudmund was renowned throughout Scandinavia for his intelligence and his seemingly gentle nature. But when his own son reached adolescence, Gudmund purchased a slave woman specifically for the boy to practice on, explaining that a man who has never broken a woman will never understand how to love one. The son initially resisted, showing what his father considered dangerous compassion toward the slave. So Gudmund forced his son to watch while he systematically tortured the woman over the course of several weeks, explaining each technique and its psychological purpose. By the end of the process, the son was not only participating enthusiastically, but suggesting improvements to his father's methods. Years later, that same son would become known as Magnus the Merciful, a king celebrated for his wisdom and kindness toward his subjects. But his wives told a different story, one preserved in private letters that weren't discovered until the 19th century. Magnus's mercy apparently extended to everyone except the women who shared his bed, whom he treated with a creativity and cruelty that impressed even his contemporaries. The cycle was complete. The traumatized child had become the traumatizing adult, passing on the inheritance of horror to another generation with compound interest. But here's the part that will keep you awake tonight. This system didn't end with the Vikings. It evolved, adapted, and spread throughout European civilization like a virus that learned to hide its symptoms while continuing to destroy its hosts. The fundamental dynamic, children learning that love looks like violence, that intimacy requires domination, that the strong earn affection by destroying the weak. This became the foundation of Western marriage for the next 1,000 years. And it's still there, lurking beneath the surface of modern relationships like a dormant disease waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. Every time you see a child flinch when their father raises his voice, every time you hear someone joke about keeping their wife in line, every time you witness the casual cruelty that people mistake for affection, you're seeing the echoes of Viking marriage practices rippling forward through time. But we're not finished yet. Because there's one final layer to this nightmare that makes everything else seem like a warm-up act. The Vikings didn't just perfect the art of breaking individuals, they turned marriage into a weapon of mass cultural destruction, a tool for conquering entire civilizations, not through warfare, but through the systematic brutalization of women and children. Their legacy isn't just in the graves they filled, it's in the minds they poisoned, the traditions they corrupted, and the definitions of love they destroyed across half the known world. You thought Viking raids were about gold and slaves, didn't you? How beautifully simple. But here's the secret that historians have spent centuries trying to bury. The real conquest wasn't territorial, it was psychological. The Vikings didn't just invade lands, they invaded minds. They didn't just steal treasures, they stole the very concept of what marriage could be, replacing it with something so twisted that entire civilizations began to mistake brutality for love, domination for devotion, and terror for tenderness. Let me show you how a marriage system became a plague that infected half the known world. When Viking longships appeared on foreign shores, everyone focused on the warriors pouring out with axes and shields. But the real weapon of conquest was walking behind them. Viking women, already broken by their own matrimonial system, carrying with them the psychological virus that would transform every culture they touched. These weren't refugees or camp followers. They were biological weapons, programmed to spread a specific understanding of marriage that would make conquered populations easier to control. The archaeological evidence from the British Isles tells a story that makes your blood run cold. Before Viking contact, Anglo-Saxon and Celtic marriages operated on fundamentally different principles. Women retained property rights after marriage, could initiate divorce, and maintain legal standing as individuals rather than property. Marriage contracts from 8th century England show agreements between equals, partnerships designed for mutual benefit and protection. Then came the Vikings, and everything changed. Within 3 generations of sustained Viking contact, marriage laws across Britain had been rewritten to mirror Scandinavian practices. Women lost property rights, divorce became male prerogative, and domestic violence transformed from criminal act to husbandly right. But here's the truly insidious part. These changes weren't imposed by Viking law, they were adopted voluntarily by local populations who had been convinced that their traditional marriage practices were weak, primitive, and unworthy of civilized people. How did this psychological conquest work? Through a process so sophisticated that modern propaganda experts study it as a masterclass in cultural manipulation. The Vikings began by introducing what they called marriage gifts, elaborate wedding ceremonies where the bride's family was expected to demonstrate their wealth and status through increasingly expensive displays. These ceremonies weren't celebrations. They were auctions, disguised as festivals, designed to turn marriage from a partnership into a commercial transaction. Local populations initially resisted, viewing these displays as vulgar and excessive, but the Vikings were patient. They gradually convinced communities that modest weddings indicated poverty, that simple ceremonies suggested the bride wasn't valued by her family, and that elaborate displays were necessary to show proper respect for the marriage bond. Within a single generation, families were bankrupting themselves to meet Viking wedding standards, borrowing money they couldn't repay to fund ceremonies that served no purpose except to demonstrate their adoption of Scandinavian values. But debt was just the beginning of the trap. The most brilliant aspect of this cultural conquest was how it used women as unwitting agents of their own oppression. Viking women, already conditioned to view their suffering as noble sacrifice, would befriend local women and share stories of their privileged position as cherished property. They would describe their husbands' violence as passionate love, their restrictions as protective care, and their terror as exciting devotion. Local women, raised in cultures where marriage was partnership, initially found these stories disturbing, but the Vikings had prepared for this resistance. They had their women tell carefully crafted tales of Viking men's superior strength, wealth, and sexual prowess, painting local men as weak providers who couldn't properly protect or control their wives. The psychological manipulation was surgical in its precision. Local women were made to feel that their freedom was actually abandonment, that their equality was actually neglect, and that their partnerships were actually evidence that their husbands didn't love them enough to dominate them completely. Archaeological evidence from Irish monastery records shows how quickly this poison spread. Within 50 years of the first Viking raids, Irish marriage contracts had transformed from documents of mutual obligation to bills of sale. Women who had once owned land, conducted business, and held political power were reduced to breeding stock whose value was measured in cattle and silver. But the true genius of Viking cultural conquest lay in how they turned religion into an ally. Christian monasteries, already uncomfortable with women's traditional roles, embraced Viking marriage practices as more properly biblical. Priests began preaching that female submission was divinely ordained, that wifely obedience was a holy duty, and that domestic violence was God's tool for correcting feminine sin. The Church didn't just adopt Viking marriage practices, it sanctified them, turning psychological abuse into religious doctrine and cultural trauma into spiritual truth. Within 2 centuries, Christianity had transformed from a faith that honored women's spiritual equality into a system that celebrated their earthly degradation. The most disturbing example of this religious transformation comes from the monastery of Clonmacnoise, where Irish monks recorded their improved understanding of Christian marriage after Viking contact. Their writings describe how they had previously misunderstood biblical teachings about wives' roles, how Viking practices had enlightened them about proper masculine authority, and how they were grateful to have learned more biblical approaches to female correction. These weren't conquered monks writing under duress. These were willing converts, convinced that their previous practices had been spiritually deficient and culturally primitive. The Vikings had successfully exported not just their marriage practices, but their entire worldview, convincing their victims that brutality was civilization and trauma was enlightenment. The speed of this cultural transformation was breathtaking. French Carolingian marriage laws, which had preserved Roman-era protections for women, were completely rewritten between 850 and 950 AD to mirror Viking practices. German tribal customs that had honored women as decision-makers and property owners were abandoned in favor of Scandinavian models that treated them as livestock. But perhaps the most chilling transformation occurred in Iceland, where 2 different cultural systems came into direct contact, and we can observe the conquest process in real time. Early Icelandic settlers included both Vikings and Celtic refugees, creating a natural experiment in cultural competition. Initial settlement documents show 2 distinct marriage patterns operating simultaneously: Viking practices that treated women as property, and Celtic practices that maintained women's legal independence. For the first generation, these systems coexisted peacefully, with intermarriage between the groups creating hybrid practices that seemed to blend the best of both cultures. Then, something shifted. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking men began systematically targeting Celtic women for marriage, while Viking women married Celtic men. But here's the key. The marriages followed Viking patterns regardless of who was marrying whom. Celtic men married to Viking women adopted Scandinavian marriage practices, while Celtic women married to Viking men were subjected to full Viking wife-breaking protocols. Within 3 generations, Celtic marriage practices had vanished entirely from Iceland, not because they were forbidden, but because they were forgotten. An entire culture's understanding of love, partnership, and family had been erased and replaced with something fundamentally alien to their heritage. The final stage of this cultural conquest was the most insidious. The Vikings convinced their victims that the transformation had been their own idea. Local populations began claiming that their traditional marriage practices had been temporary aberrations, that Viking methods represented a return to their authentic cultural values, and that resistance to these changes was actually foreign corruption of their native traditions. This psychological reversal was so complete that by 1000 AD, communities across Europe were burning historical documents that proved their pre-Viking marriage practices, claiming these records were forgeries planted by enemies to weaken their cultural integrity. They were literally erasing evidence of their own heritage to maintain the fiction that Viking marriage practices were their ancestral way of life. The Church played a crucial role in this historical revisionism, declaring that pre-Viking marriage documents were evidence of pagan corruption, that had temporarily infected Christian communities. Bishops ordered the destruction of marriage contracts, legal codes, and historical records that contradicted the new Viking-influenced orthodoxy. But the most devastating aspect of this cultural conquest was how it created false memories of the past. Families began telling stories about their ancestors that mirrored Viking marriage pattern, describing great-grandmothers as dutiful property and great-grandfathers as stern masters, even when surviving documents proved these ancestors had lived as equals. These false memories became family traditions, passed down through generations as authentic heritage, until entire cultures had forgotten what their marriages had actually looked like before the Vikings arrived. The conquest was complete, not when the last resistor was killed, but when the last memory of resistance was forgotten. And you know what the most terrifying part is? This same process is happening right now, in our time, as authoritarian cultures export their understanding of gender relations through media, religion, and social pressure. Women around the world are being convinced that their freedom is actually weakness, that their equality is actually abandonment, and that their partnerships are actually evidence that they're unloved. The Viking conquest of marriage never ended. It just learned to hide better, to work more slowly, to convince its victims that they're choosing their own chains. Every time you hear someone argue that traditional marriage requires female submission, every time you see women defending their own oppression as cultural authenticity, you're witnessing the echoes of that 1,000-year-old psychological invasion. But there's one final revelation that makes everything I've told you seem like preparation for the real horror. Because the Vikings didn't just conquer cultures, they conquered time itself, reaching forward through the centuries to poison every generation that came after. Their ultimate victim wasn't any individual woman or culture. It was the very concept of love itself, which they systematically transformed from connection into conquest, from mutual care into mutual destruction. And here we are at the end of our journey through the charnel house of history, standing before the most horrifying truth of all. The Vikings didn't just destroy lives, they destroyed the very possibility of love itself. They took humanity's most sacred emotion and twisted it into something so perverse that 1,000 years later, we still can't tell the difference between affection and abuse, between devotion and domination, between caring and control. Look around you right now. Look at the couples in restaurants, where one person orders for the other because they know what's best. Look at the wedding vows that promise obedience alongside love. Look at the romantic comedies that teach us stalking is persistence, that jealousy is passion, and that breaking someone's will is the ultimate expression of desire. Every single one of these behaviors, every twisted notion of what love should look like, can be traced back to Viking longhouses, where screams were mistaken for songs of devotion. The archaeological evidence from modern domestic violence shelters tells the same story as those ancient burial sites. Women arrive with the same fracture pattern, the same psychological conditioning, the same desperate confusion about why someone who claims to love them keeps trying to destroy them. The tools have changed, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical. Love is ownership, devotion is destruction, marriage is murder stretched across decades instead of moments. But here's the part that will haunt your dreams forever. We've been so thoroughly conditioned by this poisoned understanding of love that we've made it our entertainment. Every romance novel where the hero breaks the heroine's resistance, every movie where stalking is portrayed as romantic persistence, every song that confuses obsession with affection, these aren't accidents or aberrations. They're direct descendants of Viking marriage practices, cultural DNA that survived the Dark Ages and evolved into something even more insidious because we no longer recognize it as trauma. The Vikings understood something that modern psychologists are only beginning to grasp, that the most effective way to control people isn't through force, it's through corrupting their understanding of what they deserve. They didn't just teach women to accept abuse, they taught them to crave it, to interpret violence as proof of their value, to mistake terror for excitement, and to view their own destruction as the ultimate expression of their partner's love. This psychological alchemy was so sophisticated that it created what we now call trauma bonding on a species-wide scale. Entire civilizations learned to associate love with pain, to expect relationships to hurt, and to distrust any affection that didn't come wrapped in control and domination. The Vikings created a form of love that was actually addiction. Relationships that functioned like drug dependency, where the brief moments of kindness between episodes of abuse became more precious than genuine care, precisely because they were so rare and unpredictable. The most chilling modern example of this poisoned legacy comes from therapeutic interviews with domestic violence survivors. When asked to describe love, these women use the exact same language found in Viking marriage contracts. Love is possession, devotion is surrender, commitment as the willingness to endure pain for someone else's pleasure. They've been so thoroughly programmed by our cultural inheritance that they literally cannot imagine love without suffering, partnership without domination, or intimacy without the constant threat of violence. But the corruption goes even deeper than individual relationships. The Vikings fundamentally altered our understanding of what masculinity and femininity should look like. They created gender roles so toxic that they poisoned not just romantic relationships, but every human interaction between men and women for the next millennium. Modern men are still taught that love means conquest, that caring requires control, and that the ultimate expression of masculine affection is the complete domination of feminine will. They learn to view women's independence as rejection, women's success as emasculation, and women's happiness as evidence that they're not being loved hard enough. These aren't personal failings or individual pathologies. They're cultural programming that can be traced directly back to Viking longhouses, where boys learned that breaking women was the only way to prove their manhood. Modern women are still taught that love means sacrifice, that devotion requires self-destruction, and that the ultimate expression of feminine worth is the willingness to disappear for someone else's comfort. They learn to view their own needs as selfishness, their own boundaries as failures of love, and their own survival instincts as betrayals of romantic commitment. They're programmed to compete with each other for the privilege of being possessed, to view other women as threats rather than allies, and to measure their worth by how much pain they can endure in the name of love. The psychological sophistication of this cultural programming is staggering. The Vikings didn't just create a system of abuse. They created a system of abuse that reproduces itself automatically across generations, requiring no conscious effort or deliberate teaching. Children absorb these poisoned definitions of love simply by existing in a culture that celebrates them, by consuming media that normalizes them, and by watching adults who have internalized them. Every fairy tale where the princess needs rescuing teaches children that women are helpless without masculine intervention. Every action movie where the hero gets the girl as a reward teaches them that women are prizes to be won rather than people to be known. Every romantic comedy where persistence overcomes rejection teaches them that consent is negotiable and that no is just the beginning of the conversation. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this cultural infection is how it's learned to disguise itself as progress, evolution, and choice. Modern people genuinely believe they're choosing their relationships freely, that they're making individual decisions based on personal preference and authentic emotion. They have no idea that their choices are being shaped by thousand-year-old programming, that their preferences have been manufactured by a culture that learned to mistake abuse for affection so long ago, that the original trauma has been forgotten. The Vikings achieved something that no other civilization in history had managed. They created a form of trauma so complete, so culturally embedded, that it became invisible to its victims. They convinced entire species that their pain was their choice, that their suffering was their nature, and that their destruction was their destiny. And the most horrifying part? It worked so well that we're still living inside their psychological prison, still acting out their scripts, still mistaking their poison for love. Every time someone says that relationships require sacrifice, every time someone argues that jealousy proves passion, every time someone insists that love means never having to maintain boundaries, they're speaking pure Viking ideology, channeling the ghosts of men who viewed women as livestock and women who learned to view themselves the same way. The archaeological evidence of our modern world tells the same story as those ancient burial sites. Hospital records show the same injury patterns. Police reports document the same cycles of violence. Divorce statistics reveal the same patterns of psychological destruction. Therapy sessions echo with the same confused questions about why love has to hurt so much. We are all Vikings now, whether we know it or not. We are all living inside their definition of love, acting out their understanding of relationships, repeating their patterns of domination and submission with such automaticity that we mistake cultural programming for natural instinct. But here's the secret they never wanted you to discover. It doesn't have to be this way. Love doesn't require pain. Devotion doesn't demand destruction. Intimacy doesn't need domination. The Vikings convinced us that their twisted version of relationships was the only possible way humans could connect. But they were lying. They had to lie, because if people discovered that love could be gentle, that partnerships could be equal, that relationships could nourish rather than destroy, their entire system of control would collapse. Somewhere, buried beneath centuries of cultural conditioning, lies the memory of what love looked like before the Vikings poisoned it. Love as curiosity rather than conquest. Love is support rather than surrender. Love is the expansion of possibility rather than the contraction of choice. Love is the celebration of another person's full humanity rather than the systematic destruction of their individual will. But recovering that original understanding requires something that terrifies most people more than continuing to live in their familiar prisons. It requires admitting that everything they were taught about love was a lie, that every romantic story they cherished was propaganda, and that every relationship they thought was healthy was actually a reenactment of ancient trauma. The Vikings' ultimate victory wasn't military or political, it was psychological. They convinced us that their sickness was our health, that their trauma was our nature, and that their prison was our home. They reached across 1,000 years to claim every heart that beats today, every relationship that forms, every definition of love that shapes human connection. And as you sit there, reading these words, feeling the comfortable weight of cultural programming, pressing down on your thoughts like a familiar blanket, remember this. Every time you mistake control for care, every time you confuse possession with protection, Every time you interpret someone's pain as proof of your love, or someone's love as justification for your pain, you are not experiencing authentic human emotion. You are channeling the ghost of a Viking warrior who learned that the sweetest victory wasn't conquering lands or stealing gold, but convincing his victims to thank him for their chains, to celebrate their cages, and to call their destruction by the sacred name of love. The question now is whether you'll continue living inside their definition of devotion, or whether you'll dare to imagine what love might look like if it had never been touched by their poison. The choice, for perhaps the first time in 1,000 years, is actually yours, but choose quickly. The ghosts are watching, and they're very, very hungry.